Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you so much for having this hearing. It's extremely important. Before I get started, I just wanted to ask you to explain the significance of the cloth that you have on the table.
Representative Haaland and members of the committee, the skirt was handmade by an individual by the name of Agnes Woodward. She is originally from Canada and is married to a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa and Rikara Nation. She's made, I believe, a handful of these skirts globally, and they represent our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, our sisters. And she was directly impacted by her aunt is among the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we wear these ribbon skirts in honor of our missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the ribbon skirts also are a sign, they represent prayer, because we are a prayerful people. Thank you. Madzigidads.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The silent crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women has been my top priority since long before being sworn into Congress, and I am appreciative that I'm here today to hear your testimony to help find solutions to this long overdue issue in Indian country. I'm wearing red today in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and so I wanted to mention that. Indigenous women deserve to be protected just like anyone else in this country. This is why I've been working diligently with my colleagues on bills to provide basic protections for women and programmatic support for tribal public safety, including the Survive Act, which increases resources for tribal victims assistance through the Crime Victims Fund, the Native Youth and Tribal Officer Protection Act to extend protections to children and law enforcement personnel involved in domestic violence incidents on tribal lands, and Savannah's Act to protect Native American women by increasing communication and accountability amongst state, tribal, and federal lines and address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I would like to personally thank each and every one of our witnesses here today who have provided testimony to move this conversation forward to protect our women. Yesterday, we had a prime example of how Native women have historically lacked representation and protections in the United States Congress, and how we must continue to fight for basic protections that are afforded to other groups of people. And our chairman mentioned this. As many of you know, during the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Markup hearing in the House Judiciary yesterday, Representative Sensenbrenner attempted to amend the bill to wipe out tribal jurisdiction to exclude tribes from prosecuting non-Indians who commit violence against women-related crimes against women on tribal lands. Although this corrosive amendment was rejected, the vote was split across party lines and speaks exactly to the issue we're working to highlight today. For any congressional leader to attempt to take away protections for not only women but Indigenous women at a time when we are just beginning to understand how deep-rooted and serious of an issue the severe lack of protections are for Native women is an abomination. As a member of the United States Congress, we all take an oath that we are bound by to support and defend the Constitution, a Constitution that acknowledges that tribal governments are sovereign nations. And I take this oath seriously because every congressional leader has a responsibility to uphold the federal government's trust responsibility. I just want to say thank you, Professor Deere, for raising the issue of colonization because it has wreaked havoc on our people. My Pueblo people are also matrilineal, and at times it seems that we're still living in colonization because women are excluded from so many things. Thank you, Representative Ruth Buffalo, for running and winning your seat. You were meant to serve, And I'm inspired by the vast amount of work that you've already done since you've been in your seat. So thank you so much for that. But all of your work is so important, and I'm grateful for every single thing all of you have done to raise this issue, and I want you to know that I stand behind you 100%.
I yield Representative Haaland as much time as she desires.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll start out with a question for Ms. Giroux. Ms. Giroux, you also spoke of the jurisdiction issues, concisely referring to it as the jurisdictional maze. Do you feel this jurisdictional uncertainty often emboldens criminals to commit and recommit crimes on tribal lands without the fear of being held accountable? Does this criminal activity bleed over into urban areas as well?
I believe so, and this is my opinion. I believe that our jurisdiction, because of the land issue, which is extremely complicated, that we have weeks and months to talk about, is extremely complicated in Alaska. But in urban areas, there is an underlying, I think, culture that Native people, because of what was referred to earlier in terms of some of them not being perfect victims, end up finding themselves in situations that they're vulnerable, homeless, addiction, lack of jobs and housing. And oftentimes Native people in our communities are being brought into the urban areas because there's lack of jobs and housing, law enforcement, addiction types of services or medical services in our communities. And so they end up finding themselves in situations that they didn't plan to be in. And so law enforcement and justice systems, because those systems are overburdened with the just vast number of Native people that are in those systems, our child welfare systems, our court systems, our jail systems, and law enforcement systems are overburdened with Native citizens in Alaska in urban areas. And because of their vulnerability and because of what I spoke to, that oftentimes those vulnerabilities also speak to the fact that they're not being investigated, I think, appropriately. And they're also not being, when we talk about data, the data is not being collected on these issues, because we know that data drives a lot of the funding that would help to mitigate some of the problems. And unfortunately, it's not my favorite subject, but it is a reality that we have to deal with. So I don't know if that answered your question. But.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And this question is for Professor Deere. In December, I attended the Senate oversight hearing on missing and murdered Indigenous women and heard from a young woman that law enforcement agencies and the FBI have continuously failed at investigating these crimes. I also heard this issue again from a young woman who visited my office. What should Congress do to ensure the FBI and local law enforcement are properly investigating these crimes and acting timely on the cases? And before you answer, I'd just like to raise the issue that the FBI got its start solving murders in Indian country, the Osage murders. And so it seems to me that it is perfectly logical for them to dig in on this issue and find a solution to it. So please answer.
Thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor to be asked a question by you right now. I think we need to require federal law enforcement, the transparency is needed, require federal law enforcement agencies to track the number of MMIW reported in their jurisdiction and include that in the required annual Tribal Law and Order Act reports that are already required. I think we should require our federal law enforcement agencies to share information about missing and murdered Indigenous women with tribal nations. So if a Native person goes missing in a city or outside tribal jurisdiction, then we would ask the respective tribal nations as sovereigns are entitled to know that their citizens are missing, and so that communication happening into the tribal leadership. We need federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, to start accurately logging race and tribal affiliation in their database of missing persons. And I think any new funding for federal agencies must require that they develop protocol for responding to missing persons cases with meaningful consultation with the tribal nations that they serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and Chairman, I yield.